Hi everybody, Alan Robson here again to give you some more news. First of all, do not forget, Grisly Tales from Northumbria, 160 amazing stories in a book, just out in time for the season to be jolly. I hope you will not just like it, but love it. But what about the podcast? Now, for those of you that can remember a grisly trail that I made around Paris, the dark side of Paris, available to hear again on robsonsworld.com, I managed to get a conversation with a man who murdered and ate people. And he described, in no uncertain terms, what it was like to eat human flesh and drink blood. And he also went into detail about the differences between blood from a blood bag stolen from a hospital and fresh blood from a victim. Heavyweight stuff. Have you ever thought about cannibalism? Have you ever wondered what the taste of human flesh was like? It's supposed to be very much like pork if you cook and season it right. Not that I'm suggesting you do. Instead, have a listen to the podcast and hear about a good dozen of the world's most grisly cannibals. We don't stop there. Then we look at something else that I've always considered grisly all my life, from the very first time I ever had to wrestle trying to put a condom on, like a bed sheet, and it was horrific and grisly. But what other things have people used throughout history, from way back in Egyptian times, Roman times, through the centuries here in Britain? What do people even use now in universities in America to stop their girlfriends falling pregnant so you can have sex without a condom? Yeah, we get into that. Now, as always, the podcast is a juicy, huge thing, packed full of grizzle. And we take a look at grave robbery. Now, yes, obviously you've heard of a couple of people that have done this before, but how many of you know about bodies of famous Hollywood stars that have been stolen? The bodies of kings that have been stolen. Did you know one of Britain's most famous kings was put in a tomb with a hole at the top, and people could put their hands in and touch the skull until somebody stole his jawbone? I'll tell you all of the stories of celebrity grave robberies. And of course, when we're talking about grave robbers, everybody knows the name Burke and Hare. Not everybody knows they started stealing bodies in Sunderland on Wearside before they went up to Scotland, where they became legendary. But do you know the full story? It wasn't just as simple as, let's dig up some bodies. It's, let's dig up some bodies. Oh, we're making a lot of money. We're not finding enough bodies. Let's start making a few bodies by murdering people. And I'll give you their names, I'll give you how they were killed, I'll give you all of the opportunities that the police had to catch them. And in robsonsworld.com, we do a grisly trail of Ireland. And I meet the body, the skeleton of one of those grave robbers. To find out everything, simply check out the podcast from all the places you get podcasts and type in Alan Robson's Grisly Tales. We got a corker for you this time, and I think you'll enjoy it. Hello everybody, I hope you're all well. It is time for Alan Robson's Grisly Tales yet again. Thanks for joining me, and thanks to everyone who's been to visit the robsonsworld.com site. We thank you for that. A lot of stuff there waiting for you, and the ultimate audio adventures, if you have the courage to listen to these things with your eyes closed, hearing every single thing that we heard as we travel across the world looking for dark and spooky things. First things first, we're going to start with cannibalism. Now, an awful lot of people think that cannibalism is one of those very, very rare things, and yet let me tell you that here in Britain, cannibalism was normal, and pretty much everybody ate human flesh between 30 and 40,000 years ago. If someone died, their body would not be wasted, it would be eaten.
So, apart from our ancestors, which kind of makes us a little bit like a cannibal, I'm going to tell you about some of the nastiest cannibals on planet Earth. Now, most everybody knows about Jeffrey Dahmer in America. He murdered 17 young men between 78 and 1991, and that really was just the start of what happened, killing them. He then would hack the bodies into pieces, saving the tastiest bits in his fridge, putting others in his freezer. The rest he scattered around his building so he could nibble on them when he wanted to. He got the nickname the Milwaukee Cannibal, and he ended up with 16 life terms in prison, although he only managed to serve a couple because he was beaten to death in prison by a man called Christopher Scarver. Now, it really would take something quite special to join Jeffrey Dahmer's cannibal club, and yet one man from Kazakhstan, Nikolai Zhumagaliev, would certainly fit the bill. Now, he's killed and murdered 10 people, although the authorities know that he killed probably dozens more. He told the authorities that he wanted to get rid of all of the prostitutes on planet Earth. And so, to do this, he would attack any woman that he saw late at night, because obviously, if a woman's out alone late at night, she had to be a prostitute. She couldn't be coming home from work or anything. Now, before he even managed to get them home, he would drink their blood, and then he would slice them up, in his own time, of course, and eat their remains. And then one day he was drunk, and he shot one of his co-workers, and he was arrested. He escaped from prison twice, and the second time he was on the run for 3 years. He was eventually arrested and committed to a mental institution. Now, this is just typical of the way that our societies work. To everybody's surprise, the doctors claimed he was cured in 2005. And yet, just before Christmas 2015, he escaped from the mental facility again. Now, the officials refused to confirm whether or not Zhumagaliev is actually at the mental facility, or even if he arrived there in the first time. As far as some people know, he's out there looking for his next woman, walking around in the dark. So, who else enters this horrific cannibal club? Well, it's a fella called Armin Myers. Now, he was known as the Master Butcher. He was a German, very famous for murder and eating somebody who actually volunteered to be fed to him. Myers posted on a website called The Cannibal Cafe. Of course, there's a website for even people with cannibalistic fetishes, and he said he was looking for a well-built 18 to 30-year-old man to be slaughtered and then consumed. Well, obviously you're going to have to answer an advert like that, and Bernd Jürgen Armando Brandes answered the ad. The two men made a videotape of Myers severing and then eating Brandes' penis that both men ate. Myers then killed and ate Brandes, and when a college student noticed the online ad, Myers was arrested and sentenced to only 8 years in prison. Now, he had an appeal trial, and at that trial he stated that he still had a taste for flesh, so they kept him in the prison. Had he said, I'm over that now, do you know, society is stupid enough to let them out. So what about Muhammad Arif Ali and Muhammad Farman Ali? Now, police arrested these guys twice, Pakistani brothers, when the head of a 3-year-old boy was found at the home that they shared back in 2014. Now, they'd already been convicted of numerous counts of cannibalism, But after only a couple of years in prison, they were released. See what I mean about society? While being questioned for a recent crime, they said that they dug up and eaten the dead bodies of over 100 people buried in their local cemetery, sometimes just slicing off their favourite cuts of meat and then putting them back in the coffin. They said that their favourite dish was to make the human flesh into curry because they had an amazing family recipe. And yet, in spite of their guilt, in spite of the men admitting it, both of them have been released from prison in 2013. There was a public outcry. They're still loose to this day. And how many people who get buried in that country have relatives underground that are still all in one piece? Then there's Issey Sagawa. Now this guy was barely 5 foot tall, and he said that his 5'10" classmate, Renee Hartvelt, she's 25-year-old, was his perfect victim because she was so beautiful and so healthy. So he managed to persuade her to come to his little flat. He shot her, and then over the course of the next 2 days, pretty much ate most of her body. And when he tried to get rid of the extra bits, because this all happened in Paris, he dragged a sack full of odd bones and the bits of grisly flesh that he didn't fancy to the Bois de Boulogne lake in Paris, where a number of people saw him trying to dump this huge thing in a beautiful lake. The police came and he was arrested. So the French government extradited Sagawa to Japan. And what did they do? Well, they put him into a mental institution. But because this all happened in France and he didn't commit any crimes in Japan, he eventually, after 2 years locked away, he was able to just say that he was fine and check himself out. And he has lived free ever since. That was back in 1986. Sagawa has written a load of books making his crime famous. He even worked as a restaurant reviewer, can you believe it? And in a magazine back in 2009, he said that he was forced to make a living because being known as a murderer and a cannibal was punishment enough. Try telling that to Renee Hartfeldt's family. Okay, some more cannibals, let's have him. What about Rudy Eugene? This character was known as the Causeway Cannibal. This guy attacked a homeless man, Ronald Popo, underneath the MacArthur Causeway in Miami back in 2012. Eugene, the Causeway Cannibal, was walking along the causeway stark naked at the time. He got hold of Popo, hit him with a lump of wood, and then bit and chewed and swallowed the flesh off his face, grossly disfiguring him and making him blind in both eyes because he'd bitten, chewed and popped one of them in his mouth. The police shot and killed Eugene after warning him to get off the body time and time again, and a toxicology report showed that he'd only been smoking marijuana. His family were dumbfounded by his sudden and inexplicable behaviour and said the cannabis, the marijuana must have done something to him. We can't imagine what. Well, it made him eat the face off a living man. That man was never the same again. So how about Luca Magnotta? This was a horrific video that hit the internet years ago. It's still out there in some places. Luke Magnotta got himself an ice pick, and he's on video repeatedly stabbing over and over and over again a young man. He then got a knife and butchered the body, dismembering it, cutting off the various bits, and then started eating it raw. It was uploaded to a website, and blimey, there's a website again for everything. This one called Best Gore. The man who was the victim was recognised in the video as Lin Jun, a missing international student who was due back at the Concordia University in Montreal, Canada. A few days later, various parcels containing human body parts, all Lin Jun's, were delivered to the offices of the Conservative Party of Canada. The fingerprints and the address on the parcel led police to Luc Magnotta's apartment. By this time, he'd beetled off to Paris, and then he'd quickly left his Paris apartment and moved to Berlin. But he was still captured and sentenced to life in prison. Now, in Mexico, there's a lot of nasty, nasty things going on. Just this week, a British tourist who was having some fun in Cancun was found dead, bent in double and stuffed into a fridge, possibly by a drugs cartel or maybe just by a gang of thugs. But the police discovered a Mexican murderer, Jose Luis Calva, and they caught him eating a dish of human flesh seasoned with lemon, oh yeah, when they went to question him about his girlfriend, because his girlfriend went missing in 2007. So the police went there, and there was two of them. In his apartment, they also found the mutilated body of his girlfriend. The refrigerator was filled with human flesh. A frying pan containing human flesh in the shape of a burger or risotto. Then they found a cereal box full of human bones. Calva was also found to be working on a book, a manuscript that he called Cannibal Instincts, and there was also a photograph of Anthony Hopkins as Hannibal Lecter taped to his wall in a big poster. He was sentenced to 84 years in prison. However, Calva committed suicide in his cell after eating the thumb of his own hand. So let's keep these cannibals coming. An American prospector called Alfred Packer said that he was a cannibal, and he'd been to the mountains of Colorado in the winter of 1874 prospecting for gold, and there was no meat about. He couldn't kill any wild animals, so instead he waited till his fellow prospectors died, then he dragged their bodies into his cabin and ate them. Now, a few inconsistencies started to appear, because the more Packer told the story, the more he embellished it, and then it led to the authorities thinking, well, hang on, did all of these men die of the severe conditions of starvation? Or did he kind of help them? And it was found that the people had not just wounds where the bodies were butchered, but wounds where they were stabbed. He was sentenced to 40 years in prison, 8 years for each of his victims. He was released in 1901, and he died in 1907, so we don't have to worry about him. Let's have another Russian, because the Russians know how to do this kind of brutal, grisly damn thing. Alexander Spesivtsev. He was responsible for the murders of over 80 people. His mother actively helped him lure people to come to the house. Why don't you come to the house? We'll cook you a meal. Oh, could you come to the house? We need a cabinet moving from one side of the room to the other. We can't do it on our own. Thousands of different stories just to get people to go to the house. And then he would kill them. And he kept a diary of his murders, and he described how he tortured them, tying them to a chair and cutting off an ear and then eating it, gouging out an eye with a spoon and then chewing on it and spitting out the hard lens, cutting off people's noses, ripping out their tongues, cutting off their genitals and sharing them with his mother. He dismembered them eventually after he'd finished playing with them, and then ate them. Now, he only confessed to the murder of 19 people, but the police know for a fact the number was much, much, much greater than that. That was just based on the evidence they found at his home. They found things belonging, including paperwork and passports and identity cards, for more than 140 people. So they estimate he killed at least 80 of them. One victim, who managed to escape, told the police that she was forced to eat soup made from the dead body of her best friend. Spesev was declared insane and he was put into a mental institution. Now this sounds like, oh well, that must have happened in the 1800s. He was put into that institution in 1996. We are going back a little way to someone. Do you know, when I went to school, people would always point at somebody and say, oh, look, pervert, flasher, look at him. And you could see somebody near the school and you just knew they were dodgy. You don't know how they were dodgy. In fact, they may have been the most innocent people on earth, but some people just look as dodgy as they really are, and such was the case if ever you choose to look up the story of a man called Albert Fish. Albert Fish looked as dodgy as he was. He was an American serial killer, he was a rapist, he was a cannibal, and he was a paedophile with a disgusting, perverse taste for small children. In 1928, he abducted a beautiful little 10-year-old called Grace Budd in New York. And then, 6 years later, after all of that horror for the family, the Budd family got an anonymous letter full of spelling errors and telling a story of a man's falling into madness and becoming a cannibal, and how sorry he was. And in the letter's final paragraph, Fish remembered the full story of abducting little Grace Budd, raping her, and then once he'd raped her, tearing flesh from her body with his bare hands and eating it while she screamed. He then killed her and ate all of her flesh, scattering her bones in the local river, the East River. The authorities apprehended Fish following the letter, and he was executed by an electric chair in 1936. Okay, we've had a whole batch of them. Let's finish with one more horrific and oh so grisly cannibal. And this is only back to 2008. Early one morning, just as the sun was rising, soaked in blood, a model and a chef, Anthony Morley, ran into a kebab house. He begged somebody to call the police. And when the police got there, the people in the shop, thinking, oh, he must have been attacked, they all overheard him tell the police that he'd murdered a man called Damien Oldfield. Now, they'd had a bit of a sexual liaison just earlier, and then they'd fallen out over something stupid. So after he'd slit Oldfield's throat, Morley cut, fried, seasoned, and then attempted to eat various slabs of Oldfield's leg after it had sizzled and cooked itself in his frying pan. Morley was sentenced to life imprisonment for his heinous crime. People nearby would joke that the leg probably tasted better than the kebabs at the kebab house. Now, as you know, we spend an awful lot of time dealing with dark things. Now, remember, we encourage you all to be lovely to one another and have an amazing and incredible time sharing whatever you choose to share and never crossing that naughty line, whatever the naughty line is in your world. One of the things that I would not expect any of you to do is to steal a dead body. And that's where we're going next. Celebrity grave robberies. An awful lot of famous people have had their bodies, or various lumps of them, actually taken by people. Now, you may have heard of General Kitchener, who was sent to avenge the death of General Gordon, who was killed at Khartoum by the Mahdi's troops back in 1885. Now, as the Mahdi by that time was already dead, Kitchener had to content himself with gratuitously desecrating the Mahdi's tomb to show all of his followers that even in death he couldn't escape the vengeance of the British Empire. So he blew up the Mahdi's tomb in Omdurman and then threw the dead Mahdi's bones into the River Nile. He'd actually planned to keep the Mahdi's skull and saw off the top and use it as an inkwell. Yeah, British soldiers, terribly dignified. But when Queen Victoria heard about Kitchener's trophy, she ordered him to return it to Khartoum, and it was chucked in the river there too. Probably still with the ink in it. There are so many famous people whose bits and bobs have been pinched. The hands of the Argentinian president, General Juan Perón. Don't cry for me, Argentina. That one. His hands were amputated in 1987 and they were held for a £5 million ransom. Now, the thing is, Perón had already been dead for 13 years when the hands were taken, and the people who stole them didn't get a penny. What about Henry VIII? Oh yeah, when Henry VIII was buried in the royal vaults at Windsor Castle, a workman removed one of his finger bones and turned it into a knife handle. That knife handle is still out there somewhere. King Henry VIII, an amazing king, but no, not as famous nor as amazing as King Richard I, Coeur de Lion, the Lionheart. Now, his tomb's at Westminster Abbey in London, but the tomb had a hole in it, right at the very top, and visitors could actually put their hand into the tomb and touch King Richard's skull. In 1776, a schoolboy visiting the tomb stole King Richard I's jawbone and kept it as a family heirloom until he was found out in 1906. He'd had it for like 140 years, and then when it was announced that he had it had to be returned to the Abbey, where the hole was long filled, and they returned the jawbone to the Lionheart. So, who else? Well, Charlie Chaplin. In March 1978, the body of Charlie Chaplin was taken from its grave in a cemetery at Vevey in Switzerland, and it was held for a 600,000 franc ransom by a Polish bloke called Roman Wardos and a Bulgarian, Gancho Ganev. The body snatchers were arrested, Charlie's remains were retrieved. They were actually dumped in a cornfield a few miles away. And when the lads were asked why they did it, they said they needed the money to start a garage business. Instead, they sewed a few mailbags for 40 years. In 1876, an American gang was captured trying to steal the dead body of Abraham Lincoln. The plan was to hold it for ransom and return for the release of one of their mates, a convicted forger called Ben Boyd. Lincoln's coffin was then embedded in steel and concrete, so nothing like that could ever happen again. Let's go all arty-farty just for a bit. Goya, very famous Spanish artist, Francisco Goya. He had his body taken out of the cemetery, exhumed, from Bordeaux in France in 1888. He'd already been in the ground for 60 years. The reason he was dug up was because the Spaniards declared he should be returned to his native country for reburial. The thing is, when the coffin was opened, Goya's head was missing. Nobody knew who took it, and to this day, it has never been found. Okay, let's have another famous king, shall we? What about William the Conqueror? Yep, well, his tomb was at Caen in Normandy in France, and it's been raided by people wanting to take it twice. In 1562, it was desecrated by Calvinists during the French Wars of Religion, and then the king's bones were left scattered all over the churchyard. They came back to the churchyard, put them all back together again and reburied them. But in 1793, the tomb was robbed by French revolutionaries. And all that remains of William the Conqueror today is a stone slab marking the last place his body was buried before it was stolen. And my last story involves another artistic one, a very famous English poet by the name of John Milton. In 1790, his grave was robbed and raided by souvenir hunters. That was at St Giles in Cripplegate, London. Elizabeth Grant was the gravedigger, and she was found to be charging visitors sixpence for viewing Milton's teeth and part of his leg. Now, when I was very young, one of the things that I found a very, very grisly thing: contraceptives. Do you trust a woman that you've recently met that she's really taking the pill, or do you wear a condom? That's the thing. And also, putting a condom on can be difficult. First time I tried it, it was a bit like trying to push a marshmallow into a money box. However, you get the hang of it, and you learn how to use it, and you hope that, rather like Lewis Hamilton, you don't have a blowout when you're travelling at high speed. But contraceptive devices have always been a pretty damn grisly thing, and I'm going to prove that to you now. Back in way back in ancient Egypt, pessaries that they would stick up the woman essentially were made from crocodile poo. And if that didn't work, they would wedge a goat's bladder up there to try and block any route for the sperm to take. Lovely. That was the ancient Egyptians and the ancient Romans. Ancient Chinese, oh blimey, they would swallow 16 tadpoles fried in quicksilver, and they had to be eaten by the woman immediately after sex. Sometimes the quicksilver killed her. On other occasions, she just fell pregnant. Then we could go to ancient Arabia. They believed that if you mashed a pomegranate with rock salt and alum, you wouldn't fall pregnant. In the 1500s, in Europe, women used to have sex and then drink raw onion juice, and then they'd pour the rest of it down there. In Europe, across the 1600s, they thought that if you ate cooked cabbage immediately after sex, it would stop you from having a baby. It didn't. The Islamic courts decided what they wanted their people to use to stop them having babies, and that was to jump backwards 9 times immediately after sex. That didn't stop them falling pregnant either. Okay, Europe, the 1700s. Surely they're getting more intelligent, wiser and cleverer. They've had years to learn about these things. So they started to make condoms from animal intestines. The original condoms were made by slaughterhouse workers from sausage skins tied with a knot. The modern variety, as performed by Mr. Goodyear, vulcanized rubber, he was the man back in 1843, he started making the proper ones. In Japan, men would have a condom made for them from either leather or from tortoiseshell. Now the thing is, if you're having sex with a lady and you've got a tortoiseshell condom, you could be soft as clarts and still get the job done, if you know what I mean. Anyway, the great lover Casanova absolutely hated condoms. Instead, he put all his faith in his sexual technique. But his technique required him to insert into any woman he slept with 3 gold balls that he'd bought from a goldsmith for 50 quid. He said that this method had served him well for 15 years and no woman had ever fallen pregnant. However, most people, even the ones that wrote his biographies, explained that his run of good luck without fathering a child was because he was infertile. He was a Jaffa, seedless. So, what else? Well, in the third world, some of these are still being used. In a lot of the third world countries, they get a bottle of either Coca-Cola or Pepsi-Cola and they use it as a douche. Soon as they've had sex, they pour cola into the woman's bits and bobs. She kind of lady portion gargles it and squirts it back out again. And it is proven to be one of the most common and successful forms of contraceptive. Although I wouldn't suggest that you guys used it. Scientific tests at Harvard University proved that although regular cola has a 91% success rate as spermicide, diet cola is 100% effective. How about that? Bet you never knew. Okay, so on we go to Scotland. Well, not just Scotland, to Ireland and also England too. We talked about people who stole celebrity bodies. But what about people who steal bodies in general? Everybody's heard of the name Burke Hare and their bodies for sale business. But how much do you actually know about them? William Burke was born in County Tyrone to middle-class parents who had hoped he would become a doctor. He served in the Donegal militia and he met his wife and they married within a month of meeting. However, with the wife came her father-in-law who refused to leave, so Burke abandoned the pair of them and instead left Ireland and moved to Falkirk in Scotland, ignoring the fact he was already married and marrying a woman called Nellie. He then became a hawker, going out and about trying to make money where he could, then a cobbler, and then he moved down to Wearside to work in Sunderland on the River Wear. He was a very keen Catholic, always carrying a Bible with him. William Hare was also Irish. He came from County Armagh, and some say he left Ireland after he impregnated a magistrate's daughter. He had been merely an agricultural worker, so arrived in Scotland, finally moving to Edinburgh. He lodged in Tanner's Close with the Logue family. Now, we believe that one night, after getting Mr. and Mrs. Logue totally drunk, he smothered the man with a pillow. Within 4 days of the funeral, he was sleeping with a widow. Despite being uncouth, rough and quite aggressive, she found him strangely exciting until he began knocking her about. Margaret, who he called Wifey, was also, frankly, a hard-faced bitch who once had airs and graces, but real life had kicked them out of her. So often she would give as good as she got. In Edinburgh, they met Hare, and the three were known for partying together, raucous nights, and it was said that Margaret ended up having sex with both men. Having started grave robbing on Wearside, William Burke Hare realised there was a fortune to be made, so they quit their temporary job on the docks to travel up to the place they'd sent their recently dug-up cadavers, Edinburgh. There was a doctor, Robert Knox, who would use them in his anatomy lectures that earned him a small fortune. At that time, rich ladies and rich gentlemen who would lunch were titillated by that kind of performance and seeing dead bodies. So Burke and Hare dug up hundreds of them, with a couple of reports of one of them having sex with the body of a beautiful dead girl before passing it on. Their trick, if there was one, was to return the grave to looking as immaculate as they could, as if it had never been messed about with. They eventually slid into their first murder when their lodger fell ill with fever. So they finished him off and once again sold his dead, rotting corpse to Knox. This was a time when councils began to place guards on graveyards to avoid the body snatchers, so Burke and Hare decided that there must be easier ways than digging up the rain-sodden earth at 4 in the morning. In February 1828, they had a miller called Joseph lodging with them, who was swiftly dispatched whilst drunk with a pillow over his mouth. Within days, the lodger who took his place, Abigail Simpson, a salt salesperson, was also getting pissed and would later that night suffer a similar assault, raped and then suffocated. Little did she know that wrapped in a tarpaulin under her bed as she slept was the body of the previous tenant, Joseph, waiting to be delivered to Dr. Knox. Simpson had asked about it, had even tried to pull out the long parcel under the bed, but was restrained by wifey. So to find victims, they merely needed whiskey. Once they were out of it, it was a simple procedure. Hare, being the biggest and strongest, suffocated them, whilst Burke lay across their body to stop them wriggling free. And as a method of murder, it was totally efficient and silent. And once again, some believe that many of the dead women were used for sex before handing them over. For each corpse, £10 from the doctor, and a decent standing of living at that time. A match seller, believed to be very heavy set, a bloke called Duggan or Dugan, was the next lodger there. Now, he was already poorly with jaundice, he was suffering sweats and a fever, rather more difficult to kill, because it took far more drink to get him drunk, and at 16 stone and about 11 chins, he was pretty much impossible to suffocate. He only became unconscious after a 40-minute struggle. The bed snapped and he smashed his head on a skirting board. Burke and Hare, both sweating profusely, said that they would never ever offer lodgings to a larger person again. Now, for some reason the doctor had asked for the body of an old lady. The fresher the better. So that evening at the tavern, Hare chatted up a woman 25 years his senior. Her name was Bella, and she returned home with the three of them to finish off a bottle. Hare was believed to have said, "I mounted the stinking mare, for 'twould have seemed wrong not to." Then, as she slept, he held her nose and mouth shut until she swallowed her own tongue and died. 2 bodies and 1 tea chest, and 20 more pounds for their coffers. Now, transporting bodies may seem easy, but neither Burke nor Hare had a carriage. They used a hand cart, and they loaded it with fish boxes to pretend that they worked on the docks, dropping the bodies off along the way. They were often stopped by inquisitive police officers, but with their jokey demeanour, they always managed to talk their way out of any search. They sometimes even carried fresh fish and would bribe a policeman with a cod wrapped in newspaper. On one occasion, Burke and Hare cheated on wifey with Mary Peterson and Janet Brown, taking them back to a brother's house rather than home. Yet wifey discovered something was up. She burst in, punching Hare across the face and trying to get at Burke. Janet Brown, disgusted at discovering he was married, stormed out, losing a handful of her own hair to wifey on passing. Mary Peterson was still spark out. So they placated wifey by suffocating her and taking the body straight off to the doctor. Now, Ferguson, Knox's assistant, was amazed at how fresh the body was, asking where they'd got it from. Without a beat, they explained, It's a young woman who drank herself to death. We bought it off her friend in Canongate." Knox was delighted and put it straight into a vat of whiskey to preserve it, and would later use it for dissection classes. Burke and Hare were terrified that Janet Brown might come hunting for a friend, so they searched and searched Edinburgh for her without any success. Some say she ran off with a travelling salesman. Next came the rather portly Mrs. Haldane, a lovely laughing lady who wanted to be liked by everyone. While she was staying in the apartment, she cleaned it, she cooked for them, she washed their clothes. They liked her so much that they wanted to keep her on. But she had a problem. She had a major fault. She was honest. That meant one drunken night she would be dispatched too, and off to the good doctor. Now, to their surprise, 3 weeks later, Peggy Haldane arrived at the apartment looking for her mother, who seemed to have vanished. Burke asked if she had contacted the police and was relieved to hear that she said no. "Oh, don't worry, me lass, we'll go see them with you tomorrow." But there wasn't a tomorrow for young Peggy. Burke romanced her, had sex with her, and whilst she slept, hit her full in the face with a brass tankard, killing her outright. The doctor only paid £8 for the body because of the damage to the face. Lesson learned. Another Burke individual effort, an old woman lodged for one night. He got her drunk and smothered her, getting £10 for such a fresh example. A local cinder gatherer called Effie asked about the room. The thing is, Burke knew her quite well, so tried to talk her out of it. It seems that she'd just been kicked out of the tatty dig she was in, and she needed anywhere to stay for the night. Now, Burke really liked her, but to Hare, business was business. They brought her to the stable, got her drunk, and then smothered her. Just as they were about to take her body to the doctor, they stepped out of the apartment yard and walked straight into a policeman. The constable was carrying a drunken woman back to her lodgings by the dock. Burke said, "Don't you waste your night, officer. Stick her on the cart. We're going that way. We'll take her for you." The policeman looked thrilled. He'd already carried this drunken woman about half a mile and had a proper sweat on. He even loaded the poor woman onto the cart inches from a tea chest, with poor Effie in it. Just before leaving, the officer said, "What's that smell?" Burke and Hare's heart sank until he added, "Old fish boxes stink out the whole place. Night, boys." And the policeman disappeared into the fog. Instead, they took that drunken woman into the yard, smothered her, added her to the tea chest, and off they went again. They would later confess to killing an old woman and her dumb grandson. Burke said, "Killing the old cow was easy, but the young'un, I finished him, and I'll never forget the look on his face. Pure shock, surprise, as if he'd trusted me and I'd let him down." They couldn't fit both bodies into the tea chest, so wedged them both into a herring barrel. So on coming out, they looked a bit squashed, so they only got £8 each for their bodies. Now, by this time, they had an old horse to pull the cart, and it had proven most useful. Until the herring barrel, the horse simply refused to pull it, and it was dragged mainly by Burke and Hare. On returning to the yard, Hare was so angry he got out his pistol, shooting the horse in the head. It was sold as meat to the folk in the street. Burke and wifey MacDougall had a holiday, returning completely skint, to find Hare wearing a new suit and eating chicken, very swanky for the time. They knew he'd obviously sold another body despite his denials. A young woman from the bar they attended was missing. They knew the score. Burke and Hare came to blows, and their partnership dissolved. Burke and his wife moved out. They had been best mates for the longest time, and a few weeks later they invited a washerwoman back to the apartment to tidy it up for the Burke family's return. The woman never earned a penny. They got her drunk, and within the week she was an exhibit at another medical show. One of Wifey's relatives, Anne Dougal, arrived, expecting to stay over. She did, never to see the light of another dawn. The next victim was well known in Edinburgh, a crippled man known as Daft Jamie, who had supported himself by begging. The boys invited him in, only to find he didn't like whiskey. And he was a strong lad too. It took them 30 minutes to choke the life out of him. Now, once Daft Jamie was seen to be missing, to everyone's surprise, it even made the local newspaper. Dr. Knox asked if the body was his. They said they were sure it was not. Knox knew the score by now, so removed his head, his hands and his crooked feet before displaying the body so no questions could be asked. The family unit found themselves at a party with 6 or 7 others and noticed the perfect next victim, Margaret Docherty. They spent the night plying her with drink, singing, dancing, snogging and having sex. Finally, all of the others had left and she was murdered, choked with a sock forced down her throat. They all fell asleep with a drink, leaving the cadaver on the same bed they were sleeping in. However, 2 of their guests, the Gray family, returned looking for Margaret, and they found the drunken scene. They also saw Margaret Docherty dead, with blood and puke on her face, her eyes staring out at them, so they ran off to get the police before Burke Hare woke up. Wifey saw them leave and offered them a £10 bribe to say nothing. But Margaret was their friend. They had to tell. By the time the police arrived, the boys had already dropped the body off with Dr. Knox. The police searched, finding odd clothing items, all claimed to belong to Burke's wife. They told him that she had been drunk, but she woke up and left. The Greys were mistaken. No harm has befallen her. Now, one of Gray's friends had seen Burke Hare delivering things to the surgery of Dr. Knox and told the police, who visited just as the body of Margaret Docherty was being laid out. Everyone, even remotely connected, were arrested. An old Edinburgh rhyme goes, "Up the close and down the stair, Butt and Ben were Burke Hare, Burke's the butcher, Hare's the thief, and Knox the boy who buys the beef." Hare had agreed to cop a plea for immunity, and he told the whole story. The only difference was he blamed Burke for being the only person to have murdered anyone. Margaret Hare, Wifey, who knew everything too, travelled to Glasgow, where she was mobbed and assaulted and finally escaped on a boat back to Ireland. Burke was hanged in front of a crowd of 25,000 people on the 28th of January 1829. His corpse was publicly dissected, and a mini riot was caused because so many people wanted to see it, but there were limited places available. They used the blood from his head to write down his autopsy, and this is written in Burke's blood, directly taken from his open skull. Hare was eventually released, but first chose to be locked up for his own security. Eventually, they snuck him out of the city, and he took refuge in Dumfries. On the one occasion he was spotted, a crowd of about 200 tried to snatch him from the inn where he was staying. He kicked out a back window, hiding himself in a cell at the constable's station. A crowd gathered to hang the brute, throwing stones, battering the door, trying to tear down the prison cell wall. So the militia were called. Over 100 constables to restore order. He was taken to the Annan Road all the way down to the English border and told never to return to Scotland. Hare entered England, and what did he do? No one knows. But we're fairly sure death and murder would be there or thereabouts. Dr. Knox was tried and found innocent because he was wealthy and well-connected, and he became an early cancer specialist towards the end of his days. Huge crowds thronged the court, and finally a verdict for William Burke. Your body should be publicly dissected and anatomized, and I trust, if it ever customary to preserve skeletons, yours will be preserved in order that posterity may keep remembrance your atrocious crimes. Wifey MacDougall's case was unproven, and she was released. Gangs gathered outside her copse of houses and beat her up and chased her out of Edinburgh. Some say she plied the same craft in Glasgow, though it was never proven. And during one of my adventures, one of my grisly trails of Ireland, on one of the trips to Belfast, I visited the body of Burke because it's there on display at the medical centre, and I was lucky enough to be allowed to go up and see it. And it's a vile looking thing to look at the skeleton and the skull of a man who'd perpetuated all of that evil. And maybe you could nip across there and see it yourself. Pictures can be found on various websites. Maybe it's worth checking them out. You can also see that handwritten note in his own blood from his skull. Now, nice grisly tale for you tonight. I hope you enjoyed it. If you can help us in any way, head across to robsonsworld.com, and don't forget, I'm lucky enough to have a book out at the present moment called The Grisly Tales of Northumbria. If you're interested and you want 160 stories about incredible tales that occurred from the Scottish borders down to the North Riding of Yorkshire, and almost certainly some near where you live, if you live in the north. If you would like to purchase that, there's a link on robsonsworld.com. It'll take you directly to the publishers, and they'll sort you out. If you want a signed copy, they can provide them for you too. There's a lot of stuff to download there. Audio adventures, if you're up for them. I hope you are. And until we are together again, stay safe, stay well. The season's greetings. God bless you, and I wish you well.